everyone. Big thanks for joining from Viv and me. So Viv and I were very sad because we weren't able to meet up as planned in Edinburgh this year for the book festival. So we said we're not going to let that stop us, and we're going to have a chat anyway. So hello, I'm Gill Whitty-Collins. I'm the author of Why Men Win at Work. And Viv, I'm with Viv Groskop. She is an author of, thank you so much. She is an author of 5 books, including How to Own the Room and Au revoir Tristesse, which is her most recent fabulous book about France. She's a comedian. She's a TV, radio and podcast broadcaster, and she's also just written and produced a radio play. So Viv, I've asked you this before, but do you actually sleep?
Well, yeah, I get asked this a lot. And I wonder if it is actually a bit of a subject for our topic of discussion today. So we've billed this as the female voice, which obviously is very much part of your brilliant book, Gill. And I must say, you know, Jill's just given a lovely introduction to me. I must also give a major introduction to Gill. You know, I'm so thrilled to be back in touch with you. We were both at university at the same time, although we didn't really know each other, and we've not seen each other face to face, let alone on a video for over 25 years. So it's fantastic to have this time with you. But in the time that we have spent apart in the last 2.5 decades, Gill has become vice president of a major national corporation, international corporation, which is not something I'm ever hoping to achieve. And she's written this brilliant book about her experiences in the corporate world, having spent years at Procter & Gamble and having the inside track on diversity and inclusion and women's voices. And I loved reading this book and what you had to say about this, because I obviously come from an outsider's perspective. I'm a creative, I'm a freelancer, hence the non-sleeping. And I do a lot of work in the corporate space and with other women who have regular jobs, and men as well, coaching and teaching about public speaking and all the stuff around How to Own the Room, which is a podcast and a book. But obviously I haven't lived that myself. So it's always really interesting for me to see it from the inside, from someone who, like you, who has lived it. But this question about not sleeping, I think, is really interesting from the point of view of this idea of the female voice and the preconceptions that we have about women and where they should fit in. What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a woman leader or a woman artist? You know, all questions which I think when we were both at university, like 20, 30 years ago, we thought we were kind of leaving behind. And I've just been watching Mrs. America, the brilliant new series, which is all about early 1970s feminism. And it's kind of fascinating because all of the questions that were explored in early feminism that we thought we were starting to leave behind in the 80s and the 90s, they're all just resurfacing. And I regularly get asked, you know, oh, how do you sleep? Another book? How do you do this? How do you do that? And I find it so fascinating because I always think, well, I'm 47. I've written 5 books. That really such a big deal? I mean, that's like, you know, a book every 5 years for 25 years. Like, really? Are we setting the bar so low that women can't, you know, do these things? And yeah, I have 3 kids and I have a very busy freelance life, and I actually do sleep quite a lot and I don't do anything that I don't want to do. And I try not to make my life difficult for myself. And yet we still have this idea of women that anything that they do is some kind of major achievement. And I find that really, really fascinating. And I think it really ties in with some of the themes in your book about what we expect of women, certainly at a high level, and how it's this very sort of double-edged sword of using the idea that to be a woman in a certain situation is unusual, and that can be a real benefit, you know, because you can make yourself stand out. But it's also this double-edged sword of, oh, how strange, a woman is doing this thing. And I really find it extraordinary that we're still having that conversation. And for me, it's this disbelief that, are we really still having this conversation, that really underlines your work, Gill, and really tries to move it on and says, you know, please, let's not have this conversation in another 20 years, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I think, well, firstly, I am really glad that you do. You get a lot of sleep. That's made me feel a lot better. But I do think it's fascinating, isn't it, that you and I, obviously, since we said goodbye all those years ago at university, we have done very, very different things in some ways. But actually, we've come to so many of the same conclusions about the female voice, women, gender equality, lack of. And, you know, couldn't agree with you more. You know, why are we still having these conversations? Why are we still accepting a situation where, you know, this week was the anniversary of the 19th Amendment that gave US women the right to vote. And, you know, one of the things I said on the day was, I think if you could go back to those women who fought for that in 1920 and say to them, let me show you what 2020 is like. Let me show you how few women are in the top positions, running countries, running companies, you know, represented. I think they'd be absolutely appalled with us, to be honest. And I think they'd be very disappointed. And there's a part of me that thinks, you know, that as a generation of women, I don't think we've put in a good enough shift yet. As a generation of people, I don't think we've put in a good enough shift yet on gender equality versus the people who've gone before us. So, and I think it's fascinating that, you know, we both see, whichever angle you come from, and whatever, you know, so you've had such different much more interesting experiences than mine, by the way, I must say. We've come to the same conclusion. So yeah, let's talk about the female voice. Let's talk about why it's so underrepresented still versus the male voice, and why, to your point, is it still almost, oh, there's a woman, she's talking, she's expressing herself. Let's comment on that. Is this a good time for women's voices or a bad time? Why is it so important that women are heard? You know, especially now, you and I, we all know women have been hit so hard by COVID. I mean, everyone's been hit by it, but there's data everywhere saying that women have been much harder hit at home and at work. And it's extremely important that they're represented and their voices are heard, but sadly not. And I wanted to start us off actually by asking you about you and your voice. Because you do use your voice, you absolutely use your voice, and you use it very, very well. And I have been asking myself, you know, was there a trigger? Have you always been someone who's been confident to use your voice and has used it? Or was there a trigger at some point where you said, right, this is it, here I come?
Have I always been confident in using my voice? No, not at all. It's always funny when people say using your voice as well, and when you have this topic of the female voice, because it always makes me just think, oh, sorry, are we talking about Whitney Houston? Like, I always think of like the voice as being like,
how is your singing?
My singing voice is good. Like, anyone who knows my karaoke knows that was my road less traveled. I'd love to be a cruise ship singer, although that wouldn't be very good for COVID survival either. But yeah, in terms of my own voice, both as a performer and as a writer, it's taken me a really long time to find it and be confident in it. And sometimes I'm still not confident in it. And I think one of the most important things you learn as you get older, and as you actually do things like put books out there or put shows out there, or do things that are difficult or high pressure, like doing live TV and live radio, or big events like 4,000 people, and interviewing people like Graham Norton and Dawn French on their book tours, which is kind of how I got my break in comedy, which was in front of massive audiences, because those kind of people attract massive audiences. You learn that you need to do things before you're ready. You need to do things when you're not feeling confident, and it's through doing them that you acquire the confidence, rather than, you know, I still see so many women and lots of men as well, waiting for the moment that they're going to become confident, or putting it off, or thinking, oh, well, if I just do this amount of preparation, or if I just lose this amount of weight, or if I just I've done this half marathon or something like that. Like, people are always waiting for milestones to prove to themselves that they're ready. And what I've learned really is that to really own your voice and your confidence, no matter how sort of big or small that is. And it doesn't necessarily have to be some sort of big extrovert thing. You know, for me, it came through stand-up comedy, but it can equally be through, you know, being in a meeting and just making one very important, succinct comment. You know, it doesn't have to be about being a loud person. It can be about finding your voice as a shy person. And it really comes about through getting it wrong, trying it before you're ready, realizing that when you get it wrong, it actually doesn't matter that much and nobody actually cares. That was a huge breakthrough for me, I think, when I first started doing stand-up in my mid-30s. And then a few years after that, I wrote my first book, and I started doing Edinburgh shows. And you realize that you receive a lot of criticism and judgment and feedback that can often be very negative. And I've had, you know, 1-star, 2-star reviews for my comedy, thanks guys, and for my books, and for, you know, negative comments on loads of things that I've done. And they would often be coupled with the opposite of like 5-star reviews and people praising you and saying you're amazing, and learning to sit in your own evaluation of yourself and being confident in what you do because you think it's good enough. You realize that that's kind of where the sweet spot is, and that finding your voice is really about feeling comfortable in it yourself. Whereas I think earlier on in life, certainly I wasn't confident, and I probably came across as confident in a personal one-to-one situation, or even, you know, I guess I was pretty loud from an early age, and I didn't mind speaking in front of people. But I certainly didn't come from the kind of background where it was normal to put yourself up for footlights, you know, for example, which I kind of dabbled in a little bit when I was at Cambridge University. But I didn't really have the confidence to think, actually, yeah, I should be doing this. I was kind of thinking, oh, I probably shouldn't really be doing this. And I was always waiting for someone else to give me permission and say, yeah, you're good at this, off you go. And as you get older, I think you learn that no one ever really says you're good at this. No one ever says it. You just have to tell it to yourself, and you have to think, if I'm not good at this, somebody will stop me. But don't wait for the person to tell you that you are good. You have to kind of gather that evidence for yourself. So being comfortable with failure was probably one of the most important parts of finding my voice for me.
I think it's so important what you're saying, and I think so many women, so many people, you know, struggle with this. It's the perfectionism thing, isn't it? It's such a disease, it's such a barrier, because if you feel that, you know, if you believe that there is such a thing as perfection, which I think a lot of people do, therefore you never feel ready, because because it doesn't actually exist. You're never perfect. You're never going to write the perfect book, or give the perfect speech, or do the perfect interview. And if you're paralyzed by that, I've got to keep going until it's perfect, you'll just never do anything. And I do think many people are plagued by it. I do think women are particularly plagued by that perfectionist barrier.
Yeah, the really interesting thing about that, and maybe you learn about this the hard way in performance and in comedy, is that nobody's interested in perfection. Perfection doesn't really connect with audiences. People like realness. They like authenticity. They like to see the little slip-ups. They like to see the real you. They like to see, you know, the speaker who's like got their skirt tucked in their knickers but styles it out, or the speaker who...
Have you done that? You've done that.
Oh God, I've done every terrible thing possible. And you realize that people like you more, and they warm to you more, and they listen to you more in the moments where you're not polished. And that is what becomes really interesting in stand-up in particular, is, you know, you can't fake that. You can't, you know, put that banana skin out on the stage and purposefully slip on it. You know, you have to allow those moments to come by mistake and embrace them. And it's that sense of almost like sort of stepping off a cliff that is really, really difficult for people. And they think, oh, okay, well, I'll step off the cliff, but I'll make sure I've got my parachute on. And it's actually being willing to do that kind of without a parachute and knowing that you can cope that inspires trust from other people. You know, I'm always thinking about this in relation to, you know, I was watching Barack Obama, his speech this week at the Democratic Convention, and he's somebody who always really, really lives, and Michelle Obama the same actually, but they have slightly different styles, very much lives in the moment. You know, there are some brilliant clips of him on live television where there's a fly buzzing around and he's trying to explain a complicated economic point, and at one point he just reaches out and catches the fly and keeps on talking. And it's that ability to just stay in the moment, be who you are, like Michelle Obama said this week, understand that your message is not for everyone. There are people who are going to switch off as soon as they see you because they just don't like something about you. Well, that's okay. You don't have to win over all of the people all of the time. You just have to sort of sit in your own confidence, imagine that you can cope with whatever life is going to throw at you, because probably you can, and be open, you know, and be open to that idea of rejection and that idea that not everybody is going to like what you have to say, and you can't be in control of every single moment, and you can't stop the fly from flying around. You might try and catch it, but you might not. But why, you know, why not try? So sitting in that kind of imperfection is a really, really beautiful thing, and it's so valuable. You know, this is what's so kind of sad about, I mean, I don't know if you know Tara Moore's work. She's the author of Playing Big, which is a brilliant book about women and stepping up. And she talks about what she calls good girl behavior. And I think this is a particularly female thing, and it affects this idea of the female voice, but I think a lot of men would identify with it as well. And it's this idea that, and lots of people getting their results and all the furore of over results bears this out as well. It's this idea that at school we're taught, you know, be a good girl, get the A grades, tick every box, make sure you get everything right, don't step out of the status quo, do exactly as you're told, and then the rewards will come. And the truth is, in real life, in working life, the opposite is true. You know, you need to be able to think outside the box. You need to do the things that will make you be disliked. You need to try things without knowing if they're going to work or not. And that good girl behavior that Tara Moore talks about is really toxic for women, because nobody's interested in your speech that you've meticulously prepared and learnt off heart, but that you're reciting like a robot. You know, they're interested in the bits where you're taking a risk.
Absolutely. And of course, you know, boys are learning completely different lesson at school, right? I mean, it's absolutely been shown that while the girls are, you know, being reprimanded if they didn't do their homework on time and perfectly and with the A grades, the boys, I mean, I think the data is boys are reprimanded on average 8 times more per week at school than girls. And what they learn is, oh, it's fine. It's absolutely fine not to have done the homework and not to have done it on time. I'm not, nobody killed me. And there's just that brilliant quote about if life were one long grade school, women would be absolutely controlling the world.
Right. Well,
but
that's
it isn't.
tragic,
As
isn't
soon
it?
as you step out of school, as you say, it's you know, work has absolutely nothing to do with that, and it has absolutely everything to do with trying, failing. Oh, that didn't work, I'll do something differently next time. And nobody died when I didn't do that perfectly. So I think it is, you know, if I could give one thing, I think, to all young girls, I think I'd give them 2 things actually, and they're sort of linked. I think the first thing would be a vaccine against perfectionism. I would just get to them super early and teach them absolutely leave this perfectionism.
Oh, I'm losing you a bit there, Jill. Are you still getting me? Oh, welcome to COVID communications. Okay, I'm getting a message that I've lost Jill for now. I'm just reading Lauren Curry's question. I wonder if Alain de Botton gets asked when he sleeps. Exactly. Let's ask Alain de Botton that. I'm just checking out the comments while we're waiting for Jill to come back online. Viv mentioned the resurgence of comments on what we expect a woman she had been left behind. What does she contribute to this resurgence? That's a really interesting question. I want to get back to that when Jill comes back online. Message me, somebody, if you're getting Jill and I'm not. Yeah. Ask Jill to switch off and on the camera. No, we are not getting. Yes, thank you. This is great. I'm getting this in real time, what everybody's getting. Okay, I'm going to wait for Jill to come back on. Okay, she's coming back. But meanwhile, I want to reply to that question. Oh, hi.
Yes,
Hi there.
Sorry, I could hear you, but
you could hear me.
I was
okay.
happily chatting on. So you were just answering a question.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to get to this really interesting question because I think it speaks to a lot of the points in your book, and a question I wanted to ask you. So Sandra Lizioli, who has the most Lizioli has the most beautiful
gorgeous name.
She says we talked about the resurgence of comments on what we expect of women, that the sort of idea that we hoped we'd left behind, this kind of prejudices and biases that are really, really surfacing during this COVID moment. You know, the idea that if you're pregnant, then you're going to be first on the furlough list. I mean, it's like something out of the 1940s or 1950s or something. Anyway, yeah. So she asks, what do we attribute this resurgence? And for me, the answer to that is that I think we've always lived in Western democracies in profoundly conservative, with a small c, environments. And we've sort of had this very superficial conversation for the last 50, 60 years about inclusion and diversity, about LGBTQ, about women, about racism, about everything that has been very much on the surface and has been very dominated by certain voices, you know, of which I would include, like, you know, white women as one of them. And this really, it plays out in Mrs. America that I was mentioning before, that, you know, Gloria Steinem's there and she's amazing, and she has a black colleague who's constantly saying, I'm not really being listened to. Nobody really pays any attention. They're like, yeah, can you be quiet? Gloria's talking. And in the end, a young black colleague says, I'm going to go and work in San Francisco now because nobody listens to me here. And all of that.
We all know that feeling.
Yeah, and I think we all just paid lip service to these ideas for a long time. And it's only really now that we're doing the hard work of saying what works, what doesn't work, who's being heard, who's not being heard. Tell us about the nasty things that you're going through. Let us think about how we're responsible. Let's think about why all this is still being upheld after all this time. And a lot of it is to do with, we're only just discovering about unconscious bias. You know, we all have unconscious bias, and we can't do very much about it because it's unconscious. Like, that's hard work to get rid of unconscious bias and those snap judgments, you know, that kind of Malcolm Gladwell blink idea. You know, we all have that inside us of man, woman, you know, all the different dichotomies that we're kind of trained for thousands of years to make snap judgments about. And now we're all educated. You'd think we'd be out of that, but we're not. So that's my answer to that. The thing I wanted to ask Jill, who I'm now worried that she's gone. She's gone. Okay, I'm going to ask it anyway and hope that she's listening. I wanted to ask Jill, what was the moment for you in corporate life when you suddenly realized that sexism was a thing and that there was a glass ceiling? Because that was one of the things I really loved about your book, was that you say, I went through 10, 15, 20 years thinking women can do anything. This is great. Just like we were told when we were at school, right? Being a woman doesn't mean anything. You can do whatever you want. What was the moment when you suddenly realized, oh, actually, that's not quite true, is it?
Yeah. So sorry, I've just switched devices because the other one was giving me problems. So hopefully this one will be a little bit better. So I will answer that, but I was really enjoying what you were saying before I got cut off there. And I did just want to build on it, on the question of you know, why is this happening at the moment through COVID? And I think I agree with everything that you said, but what I'd say on top is this was there. It was there before. It was there before March. If we actually look, BC, before COVID, there were, all the data says women were taking 80 to 90% of the responsibility for, if they were in, if they had a partner, if they had a child, they were taking 80 to 90% of the responsibility for the housework, the cleaning, the shopping, the cooking, the kids. So it was already there, and they were, doing all of that unpaid work. But I think that, that was an extreme burden, but I think women were almost coping. It was just about coping. And I think what's happened with COVID is a combination of extra work, obviously kids at home, homeschooling. They've taken on, instead of what I hoped would happen, which was that, in a traditional marriage or partnership, the men would say, okay, I'm working from home now. I can, my goodness, I've just noticed how much work I'm not doing and how much work she is doing. I'm going to take my share. Actually, that hasn't happened at all. And women are reporting in all the surveys that they've taken even more of it than before. So they were already at that sort of limit of, in a 24-hour day, how much can a person do? And this is, they've taken on even more of that. And the reality is, you combine that with, if they have also got a paid job, when does the work get done? When does it, how do you get that paid work done? And how do you get it done as well as the man who may be your competition, who doesn't have the same, who isn't carrying the same unpaid work? So I think the issue was always there. It's just now been tipped over to a point of being pretty disastrous, actually. And, a lot of men have actually written to me, and, good, decent men who've written to me and said, I've tried to help out more. I can see that I need to help out more. But my employer is not very sympathetic to me saying, can I have a little bit longer for that because I've got homeschooling? My employer is actually much more sympathetic to the women who are asking for, they don't even need to ask, because there's an assumption that there's a woman and she might have some of those responsibilities, which is just profoundly sexist in itself. And we see that all of the parental policies in most companies, they're really mum policies. They're really, the expectation is that they will be taken and used by the mums. And actually, it's as sinister as, frowned upon a little if they're taking it. So I think it was there. COVID's tipped it over the edge. We know it's damaging. We know that women's work is suffering, their careers are suffering, and I think, as we've said, it either is going to be an absolute disaster, and we do stay stuck in the 1950s, or we're going to say, actually, we've reached such a tipping point now that we have to do something about this, and we have to make a change, because sometimes a crisis is what you need to lead to change. So I'm kind of hoping that is what will happen. But yeah, so to your question, you were asking me what was my tipping point for when I realized that I couldn't actually do anything. Is that yeah?
Yeah, well, when you challenged yourself to think about this idea. I mean, I remember growing up, I went to I got a scholarship to an independent girls' school, and we weren't allowed to learn how to touch type, because the headmistress said, I don't want any of you going out into the world and becoming secretaries. This became like a major problem for me, because I couldn't touch type, and touch typing is one of the biggest things that I do in my life as a writer. But I grew up with that mentality, which I'm sure you did too, of, yay, women can do anything. You don't have to be a secretary, you can rule the world. So what was the moment in corporate life when you and I know that you don't want to berate any of the employers that you've worked with, and you've had good experiences with them, but you could see in senior management generally, suddenly, actually it's not a level playing field. How did that come to your consciousness?
I mean, it took such a long time for me. I was so slow. On this, and I always say I am ashamed to admit that I was one of those women for dismissed gender inequality a little bit. I was not that I didn't know it existed, of course I did, but because I hadn't been affected by it, I was a little ashamed. I was too dismissive of it. And, you know, like you, I was one of three sisters, the third of three sisters. So there was none of that boy, you know, brother, sister, inequality in the family. My dad was forced to be a feminist, whether he wanted to be or not. I went to a mixed comprehensive school. Never occurred to me to think that I was anything but the equal of any person or any boy there. University, you know, I mean, where we were at university, I was by far from the most brilliant, but the brilliant people that were men and they were women, there was none. And then in my career for a very long time, I was was not affected by it. I was in marketing. I came through the marketing function. I joined a company that is very, very focused on this issue. They're very intentional about recruiting 50% women, particularly into that kind of function. They do struggle a little bit more with engineering and science-based functions, but they argue that that's to do with the profile of degrees. But so I was very much it was really up until the last few years, never occurred to me to, and I just didn't feel it. I felt that I was dominating the culture as much as anyone, to be honest. And then it was really at the vice president level. So it was when I got to a point where, you know, as was the company, most companies are intaking 50-50. What you see, obviously, at each level is the women slowly disappear, and at each level it just gets to a lower percentage of women. And I think, you know, for me personally, and I know it's different for different women in different careers, I was lucky, actually. I hit it late, other women hit it sooner. It was the vice president level, and it was when it really became 80% male. And I found myself in a male-dominated culture for the first time in my life. And I didn't know what to do with it. I mean, it was like landing on another planet for me, because I was finding myself in meetings that were mostly men. There were some women in there, but it was mostly men. And I'd say that's when it hit me. It didn't hit me. It was relatively gradual, because at first it didn't occur to me. It was, okay, well, I've noticed that there aren't many women in this room, and I've noticed that it's for men, but I'll just carry on, you know, no problem. I'll just carry on being me, doing what I've always done. And I slowly began to see that what I've always done didn't have the same impact in this culture. And importantly, because this absolutely is not about me, you know, it's, I started to see the impact it was having on the women around me. So the women around me, I mean, absolutely brilliant women who'd got to this level, and who I saw operating outside this culture. I saw them operating in the more balanced culture, and I could see that they were completely different people. One of them actually said to me once, "I am a different person in those meetings, and I don't even know why." And so I started to realize that, and then I became fascinated by it, and I started to read books and articles, and became a real student of it. And that's when I realized that this was not about me, and this was not about the place I was in. This was everywhere, and that women were affected by this dynamic everywhere, and that it was limiting their voice. So even women who had always, you know, used their voice in business and been extremely successful, found themselves less able to use their voice, or certainly that their voice was having less impact than it had before. And so I became fascinated by exploring what happened and how can we avoid that.
Yeah, well, let's get straight to the how, because we're getting lots of great comments here and questions. Erin Thorpe, is it that we aren't using our voices as women, or we aren't being heard by others? What helps to ensure we are heard? $1 million question. Sandra says, I'd like to hear more about how to persuade women to use their voices more and be heard. Jill, from your corporate experience, what are your tips of how women can not only use their own voices and make themselves heard, but persuade other women to speak up more as well? And is it really about us speaking up, or is it about persuading other people to listen? How do we break through all of that?
I mean, I think there are so many things in this, and I absolutely want you to talk about this because I love what you say and how to in the room about this. I think probably my biggest tip would be recognize, don't be in denial about it. Don't be in denial of the importance of the voice. If you are, no matter how competent you are, no matter how brilliantly you are doing your job, if you're doing it quietly with your head down and you are not speaking up, you're not making your work visible, you're not networking, and importantly, you are not performing and you're not being confident and visible in the place where, and I'm talking the corporate world here, where you are most judged, which is the meeting. I mean, I've got a chapter in my book called Giving Good Meeting because it's fascinating. We are so judged in the meeting, and I think a lot of women are a bit naive about that, and they think that their work is going to speak for itself, and everyone's going to notice what a fantastic job they're doing. And actually, I think what a lot of men realize very, very early on is they need to absolutely put in a brilliant performance in those meetings, because we're judged, unfortunately, so much more by what we say and how confidently we say it than actually on the competence behind it. So I think what I'd say to women is just recognize that that is a reality, because you're going to get extremely frustrated if you don't, but also just do it your way. I think that would be the biggest thing, I would say. And I've interviewed a lot of fantastic women who are extremely successful, and I think the ones who do this well, they don't try to be men. They don't, they recognize that, okay, in general, the men in the meeting, they'll dominate the conversation. They will talk a lot more. They'll talk a lot more deeply. They'll hold the floor a lot longer, and they will interrupt. It's a male dynamic. They're very comfortable with it. We're not. We're much more polite. In general, put our hands up. Can we input now? So it's absolutely not about saying, okay, right, I need to do it the way the men are doing it, because that's just going to stink of inauthenticity, and it's not going to be you. It's, find your way, your way of expressing what you have to say. Do it your way. So I had a great quote from one of the P&G presidents, who said to me, I've learned that it is absolutely not share of voice that is important. It is share of impact. And I do really believe that. If you can, to your point, find, just the killer way of expressing something in a way that people are really going to remember, that's going to be a lot more powerful than saying, right, I need to hold the floor for 10 minutes because that's what the men are doing. So I think recognizing it's a reality, and actually really thinking about, how can I do this in a way that I feel comfortable with and that is me, and therefore find my own way of getting through. And I think importantly, and this is where I want to get you to talk a little bit about what you say and how to in the room, but it's that point of, and just do it, please just do it, because if you leave that room, that meeting, wherever, and you didn't say something that needed to be said, if you had an insight on the business or a point or something that people really needed to know in order to make a good decision, and you didn't find a way to express that, no matter how difficult it is. I know how difficult it is when it's a room full of men, and it can be very intimidating, and you do get interrupted. But think of it as a responsibility. If you don't find a way to get that across, that group of people who could be about to make a really, really important decision will not take into account your insight. They will not take into account the insight that your diversity brings, and they'll make a bad decision, and that will be on your head as well as on theirs. So please do it. So, and I want it, because I know you say this brilliantly in your book, in How to in the Room, you say brilliantly about, just because you're not Michelle Obama, do it anyway.
Yeah, well, I'm so interested how you talk about that, Jill. I mean, I think what you say is true and useful, inspiring. I can feel a lot of people listening to that and think, yes, but how,
Mm-hmm.
where do I find the confidence to do this? What happens if I say this and I mess it up? And for me, one of the things I've learned from all the conversations that I've had on the podcast, How to Own the Room, and all of the face-to-face stuff that I've done with people talking about these things, is that one of the most useful things is to remember that you're not a stereotype. So a lot of the pressure that you might get from thinking, oh, if I don't speak up now, then it makes women look a certain way, then you're kind of painting yourself as being representative of all women and thinking, oh, if I don't speak up now like Michelle Obama and be amazing, then it's going to make women look rubbish. I used to have this in comedy. I used to always think, oh, if I have a bad gig, then people are going to think women aren't funny. And maybe they are, but the truth is they're just going to think I'm not funny. And that's fine, because I'll do it again tomorrow and it'll be funny. So what I find really useful is just to think the only person that you can be is you. And don't be putting all this stuff on your shoulders of you represent all women, and if you don't do this, the whole of womankind will be lost. That's way too much pressure to put on one person. And so sort of, it's almost self-contradictory what I'm going to say here. So on the one hand, depersonalize it. So don't be thinking, I have to fix all of this. You have to depersonalize that, because the idea that you have to fix 4,000 years of patriarchy in one interaction in a meeting is an insane pressure to put on yourself.
Absolutely.
So you depersonalize it and think, this isn't happening to me. This is happening because it happens. This is a culture. Something I think Lauren brought up in the comments, that, we live in a culture that is becoming more and more conservative. There's a lot of very strange political forces at work that are undermining lots of the gains of the last 50, 60 years. As an individual, it's very difficult to take all of that on your shoulders and do something to reverse it. So don't be thinking of yourself as being some sort of stereotype who's a representative of all this. Just try to dig into you and who you are. And the thing I have found really useful that echoes something you said earlier, it's this idea of whatever you're going to do, however you're going to make this change, however you're going to speak up, it might not look like something that we've already seen. It might look like something completely
absolutely
new. You might not even know what it looks like until it comes out of your mouth. And we see that in really inspiring examples like Malala, Greta Thunberg, and to some extent Michelle Obama, who has spoken up in a way that no First Lady has ever spoken up before. We don't know what power and change looks like until we see it. And the people who I think have been most frustrated by some of the messages in How to Own the Room, the book and the podcast, are the people who say, yes, but please can I have the formula? What is the formula? How do I write a speech? What do I say? How do I stand? Please tell me points 1, 2, and 3. No, you can do that, but that's pretty empty. That's going to give you a sort of robot, alpha male, identikit kind of weird thing that isn't going to work. You need to be prepared to do something that is totally new, because whatever we've been trying for the last 50, 60 years, it hasn't really worked. So Absolutely. One thing I've started to say a lot more recently as well is, maybe work on your listening. I've been trying to do that myself. I know that sounds ironic because I talk a hell of a lot, but I try to work on my listening. I listen really, really hard and sometimes think, do I really have a contribution to make here that's going to take things on? And if I don't, I keep quiet. Because listening can also be as valuable as speaking up. And listening allows you to watch what other people do, to take control, to take power, to be heard. And often, really, really great leaders, they're much better listeners than they are speakers.
It's so true. And there's nothing more powerful, is there, than when a person feels listened to, when something that they said, when they feel that someone truly understood it and plays it back to them, then they're listening to you, because then, they listened to me, so there's a connection there. It's an extremely powerful tool. But I couldn't agree with you more about the be you. know you and be you. I think that is the biggest thing. And I think it goes beyond actually using your voice in meetings or speeches or wherever. I think for me, it's probably the biggest tip for any woman, any person actually, in any workplace, anywhere, because it's so tempting. It's so tempting to just go into a place, think, oh my goodness, I'm not like anyone else here. Everyone else seems to be in the gang. Everyone else seems to belong. I don't. So let me try to fit in. Let me try to copy. Let me try to see how they do this. And, some people can have a pretty good go at that, because some people, are good performers. But it doesn't work. Ultimately, it doesn't work, because ultimately, people will feel on you. They will feel that you are not quite yourself. There is something not quite, I'm not really connecting with this person, because they're not fully comfortable, they're not really themselves. It's far, far better to say, let's start with, who am I? What am I absolutely great at? Everybody has superpowers. What are they? How am I going to bring those, and how am I going to focus on that, and stay away from the rest, and not try to do something. I mean, I love your story about, you watch her speak, and she is her, right? She has understood what she is. She's understood that she's never going to be Oprah Winfrey, and she's herself. And it works. It works and by the way, if she tried to do anything different, it wouldn't work. So I'm fully with you. I just saw a question about that, but I missed it.
Yeah, let me ask you this really interesting practical point that Alex Campbell has raised. This question comes up the most in all of the events that I do about how to win the room, whether it's virtual, and obviously we're learning new ways of interacting and getting our point across now that we're using video conferencing more. But this came up all of the time when I was doing events before we went into lockdown about how to win the room. What method would you use in a meeting to cut into a discussion? She says sometimes the male voices are so strong it's difficult to jump in. Jill, you must have experienced that many times. What would be your tip of how to get in there?
I mean, firstly, I would say, I hear you. It's so difficult. And I think, one of the things that's difficult about talking about gender equality and women's voices and men's voices is you have to generalize, right? Of course, there are women who don't struggle with this and there are men who do, but I'm generalizing because it's the only way you can talk about it. But absolutely, I think virtually every woman on the planet has felt that. And we will, in general, there is just a different dynamic. Men are extremely comfortable to hold the floor. I mean, I've been in meetings where, I remember actually in the last couple of years when I was vice president, when I decided I was going to write a book about this when I left. And I was really watching, I'd really started to watch. And I remember there was one meeting where a guy, he wasn't running the meeting. He was just another participant in the meeting, just like myself. And at one point in the meeting, I'm not lying here, at least a 10-minute effective speech from his seat with 5 points. And he just held the floor for 10 minutes. And well, firstly, I thought, I have never seen a woman do that. I've never seen a woman do that in a meeting if she wasn't chairing or running the meeting. I've seen her present and do that. I have never seen a woman with the confidence to do that. And then the second thing that I noticed was a couple of minutes later, one of the women made a point and was interrupted after, about 30 seconds. And that's an interesting dynamic as well, by the way, because I think most women have experienced that. And what happens is that over time, you get nervous because you think, right, I know I've got a deadline before I'll get interrupted. So you start to rush. And so I think, how do you cut in? I mean, firstly, I think it's very difficult for us to cut in because we're not as comfortable with interrupting. But what I would say is watch the men. They do interrupt all the time, and they interrupt each other, and they're not offended by it at all. They're not offended by the interruption, and that's part of the problem. They're not offended by it, but the women are very offended when they get interrupted and they haven't been allowed to finish their point, and they waited patiently for 20 minutes to be able to to cut in and do it. So I think it's a case of, I'm not saying to be rude, but having the confidence to cut in and just finding that moment to cut in. And I think to your point about if you can show you've been listening when you cut in, so it's not a non sequitur cut in of, okay, I've got really bored of you talking now, so I'm going to just come in with this. It's almost when I've done it and it's worked, and it's not easy. One of the things that I've used is the almost, quite excited by the point you've made. So I
love that. I'm so excited by the point you've made. It's made me think of my own point.
I have to cut in there because what you're saying about that, that really resonates, and I would love us to talk about that, because now it has to be genuine. If they've made an absolutely rubbish point and you're just using it, but I think just that it's your point about we're all human beings. We all want to express, even if we're shy to do it, and we all want to feel that when we did express, it was heard. So I think I guess the tip would be have the courage to do it. Have the courage to say to yourself, I'm not going to leave this room without making my point. And how can I do it in a way that I feel it builds on this person and recognizes the person rather than being rude to them. The other thing, and it's a basic tip, but I think it's an important one. Get in early in the meeting, right? With something. Get in early with something. It becomes, I think a lot of women will relate to this, but if you don't get in early, and it's, let's say the meeting's 2 hours long, which by the way, sometimes they go on for days, but, and an hour has passed, 90 minutes has passed, and you still haven't managed to get in. There's this overwhelming tension building in you of, I have to say this, I have to say something, and it just gets worse because you feel like, I'm really intimidated now because this is going to be the first time my voice is heard in this meeting. So it's a basic tip, but early on in the meeting, just say something, just register your voice in that meeting, because it will make it easier for you to chip in later, and you won't get that sense of, oh, now everyone's looking at me like I'm weird because I've finally spoken.
Yeah, I have a really extreme example of that. I was on a University Challenge a couple of weeks ago, the Christmas edition, which is for our beloved
Selwyn.
Yeah, for Selwyn, for my Cambridge College, and obviously it's for old people, not for students. It's the old people one. And I was in the minority as a panelist, as a woman, and I was very conscious of this. And I really thought, what is the worst thing that could happen during this program? And I thought the worst thing that can happen is that I don't speak. And so I promised myself that no matter what happened and no matter what the question was, I would buzz on the first question and I would be the first person to answer it.
Yeah. And
I made myself do it, and I didn't know the answer. I just had to make up an answer, and I put us straight out of the gate on -5. But I could then relax because I knew that I'd spoken. And for a while I was like, Viv, that was one of the worst decisions of your life, and you've just made the team go into minus points because you insisted on a woman's voice being heard and the woman being wrong. But it ended up creating this really interesting dynamic where our team then had to fight back, and we spent the whole of the next 10-15 minutes fighting back from a losing position, and we ended up winning. And so my fail at the beginning actually created a kind of underdog momentum that then allowed us to win. So it's nerve-wracking to have that moment of thinking, I need to speak even though I don't really have anything to say, or I need to make myself heard just to break the ice. But doing it's again embracing that thing I was saying before of being spontaneous, taking a risk, jumping off the cliff, and then embracing whatever comes next.
And I love that story. And I think it's not taking ourselves too seriously as well. And not taking ourselves too seriously, not thinking, everyone. I think so often we live life as if we're the center of the universe and everyone's watching us and everyone notices everything that we do and say. And they don't. People don't really notice they don't really notice all of the boring inane, not really going anywhere points that people make. What they notice is when somebody says something very, very insightful, and nobody does that all of the time. So I think taking it less seriously, it doesn't matter if I don't articulate my point brilliantly. It doesn't even matter if it's not a brilliant point. I need to participate anyway, and just, you know, be in this, contribute, be a voice. And it is much, much better to be an active voice for the whole time, rather than just to sort of say, right, I'm going to say one thing, I'm going to say it at the end, I'm going to be terrified to say it, I'm going to rush it because they're going to interrupt me, and then it's not going to make any impact anyway. So I think it is forcing yourself to do it, and then realizing that, hey, it's really not so bad. I think one of the big things about men in general that they've told me, they don't take work as seriously as we do. It's a bit of a game for them. It's quite social, and it's a bit of a game, and they play it that way. It's not life or death if they got something wrong or they said something wrong. And I think we can learn a lot from that, actually, because, by the way, it isn't like, usually, unless you're doing an extremely important job. You know, I essentially used to sell moisturizer and soap. It was really fine if I didn't, you know, get everything perfect. So I think it's brilliant to just say, you know what, I'm going to do this, and who cares? I'm going to laugh. Laughter, isn't that the best thing we can do? Is smile at ourselves and say, oh, okay, didn't quite get that right, never mind. And actually, these stories tell, right? Who tells the stories about the stuff that they did absolutely brilliantly? Now, I'm aware that we're quite close to the end, right? So are there
we're
any,
also like millions of amazing questions. Like, there are just amazing points and questions from people. This is great.
Is there any last one that we should
I think
close
this would be a good one. There's a great question about supporting younger colleagues. Hermione says, what do you think about senior women supporting or not their junior colleagues? Let's broaden that out and say, what can we all do to support other women more?
And I'm wondering if that's our Hermione as well, and if it is, big hello to you. Yes, it is. This was actually going to be one of my questions for you, so thanks for asking, Hermione. I think this is one, you and I think we agree on so many things. I know we both love France, we both love the French language, French literature. We both like to use our voice quite a lot. We both believe in women. We both believe in gender equality. We both support that. I, though, have, in general, not experienced the sisterhood, particularly from women at the senior levels, as much as I would have hoped. I've been quite disappointed. I've got a chapter in my book called Sisters Are Not Doing It For Themselves, which I think is quite a title that speaks for itself as a chapter. I think that there are exceptions, but far too many women who make it to the top do not actually support and lift the women below them. And I think that, you know, there are many, many things to drive gender equality that we need men to do. We need them to embrace, and we need them to help with, because they have the power. And if they don't help us, we're not going to get there. But this one is on us. This is something only we as women can do. Men can't do this. I think we absolutely have got to, you know, just get better. And I know there are women who do. I absolutely know there are women who do, but there are far too many women for me who don't. But I think you've had a different experience, which I find very encouraging.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I've written a book on this, Lift As You Climb.
Oh, I know.
A lot of ambition, that is all about answering this question of, it was inspired by the Madeleine Albright quote, there's a special place in hell for women who don't help other women, which I kind of agree with, but I also think, I don't really want to go to hell. Have I helped enough? And why don't we put men under this pressure? So it really asks this question of, like, men, women, in terms of inclusion and diversity, like, what can we all do to help each other? How can we break through these things? How can we do it genuinely and not just pay lip service to it? And for me, one of the most practical things you can do is to spotlight other women in whatever way that you can, whether it's recommending them for things, putting their stuff on your social media, remembering to send them a note saying that they did great at something. Doesn't matter if you know them or not, and do it with zero expectation. So don't do it because you hope that you're going to network with them and they're going to give you something, and like, just do it openly, you know, just have that spirit of generosity of saying, you know, I loved that you said this, I loved that you did this, I love this thing that you know, just be more open with your response to appreciating other people's work without doing it in a transactional way. I think that is incredibly helpful. And that happens quite a lot in the worlds that I work in, like in comedy and writing. People are generally pretty open about that kind of praise because we all know that we work in really, really tough jobs, often in total isolation. We don't have that team thing going on that people have in corporates. So we're quite good at just reaching out to other writers and saying, I loved your piece, or I see you've got a book coming out, how can I help? It's definitely got that quality. And I think if maybe people could bring more of that into the corporate space, it would be really, really helpful. Oh, you're gone. And Jill, are you there or not? I'm talking to myself. This is, well, it's like, this is my life.
I think we've...
I love that somebody's mentioned Queen Bee and Margaret Thatcher. Yeah. Women in general do not support each other, i.e. Mrs. Thatcher. Yes, many people mentioning Mrs. Thatcher. She hasn't been the greatest role model for any of us. Jill, am I going to let you sign off if people can hear you? Or maybe I should sign off? Somebody tell me what to do in the comments and we'll find out. Oh, hi to Joe Stanton in Bermuda. Thank you so much, Angela, Hermione, Barbara, Catherine, Carl. Thank you so much to everybody who's been putting your brilliant comments. I'm going to go back through and read all of these because they've been fantastic. I am not wanting to sign off from this conversation because it's been so interesting, and I want to really flag up Jill.
Viv, I could talk to you
yay.
all day. Sorry,
Great.
I didn't realise, I didn't know whether we'd lost me or you, so I was talking away there as well. I could talk to you all day about this and about everything, and I wish we could, but there's so much more to say, isn't there? There are so many things we didn't talk about, so I hope we can do it again. And I hope, thanks so much to everyone who joined and who asked the amazing questions. I think we could have spent hours just discussing those, and yeah, so thank you so much for
celebrating your book. Yeah, look, this is our virtual Edinburgh, so we need to go and have a very large gin and tonic now.
Oh yes, what a fantastic
dark and dirty bar. Like, I'll convert my kitchen. I'll go underneath my kitchen table and drink gin and tonic. That will give the same effect.